There is a truth about a great room full of light that no one who has always stood inside it will ever learn. It is a thing you come to know only from the edge. A room made warm by 100 candles and 100 easy voices, where the fires are banked high and the music never falters, is not in fact warm all the way to its walls. The warmth gathers in the middle, where the people who belong are gathered close, and it thins as it travels outward, the way heat always does, until at the far edge, against the cold plaster and the tall painted pillars, there is a margin the light never quite reaches. Every such room has that margin, and every such room keeps something in it. It keeps the people it has decided not to see. They are not turned out. That is not how the thing is done in a civilized place. They are simply left standing at the edge, unspoken to and unpartnered, until the cold of the wall behind them has soaked all the way through, and they understand at last, without one unkind word having been said aloud, that they were never truly asked at all. A hard winter only makes the lesson plainer. The warmth that will not reach the edge of a bright ballroom is the very same warmth that will not reach the wrong side of a shut door, and a person may freeze as surely in the corner of a grand assembly as on any step in any street. The assembly is only the crueler of the two, for it makes you stand and watch the warmth you are refused. On the coldest night of that long northern winter, in the assembly rooms of the town of Marchford, there was such a room, and such a margin, and standing in the margin, half hidden behind one of the tall pillars, there was a young woman doing the one thing that is left to the unwanted, which is to try with all her strength not to be seen at all. Her name was Tamsin Larkford, and she was 24 years old, and until 2 years before she had been a gentleman's daughter, with a good name and a place in the world. Now the name was the trouble, and there was no place anywhere that would have her. She stood with her back to the pillar, and her shoulders drawn in, and she kept very still, because stillness, she had learned, was a kind of hiding. What she was hiding was her shawl. It had been a good shawl once, a soft gray wool her mother had chosen, and it had gone thin at the folds, and there was a place near the hem she had mended twice, and the second mending showed. In the middle of that bright room, where the other women wore silk that had never been mended once, a mended shawl was a confession. So she kept the pillar at her back, and the worn hem turned to the cold wall, and she counted the minutes until she might decently go. She had not wanted to come. She had come because it was the last thing she could think to do. Every respectable house in the county had closed to her by then, one after another, and the assembly at Marchford was the single door left, that a person of her birth might still walk through with a paid card of admission, and no one able to stop her at the step. She had come in the small and foolish hope that in so large a company there might be one soul who did not yet know the name, or one who knew it and was kind. Some family in want of a governess, who would look at the straightness of her back and think, "There is a girl who has known better days and would work hard to have them again." That was the whole of her hope. It was not a large one. Within the first quarter of an hour, she had watched it fail. For the name had come to Marchford before her, as it always came before her now, and she had learned to watch it do its work, the small tightening of a face, the drawing back, the polite eyes gone suddenly to some point beyond her shoulder, and then the turning away, and the warmth carried off with it, the way a lamp is carried out of a room and leaves it colder than before it came. Everyone in that room knew the name, which was the worst of it. 2 years before, her mother had been accused of theft. Cecily Larkford, the gentlest woman Tamsin had ever known, a clergyman's daughter who had never in her life taken so much as a ribbon that was not her own, had gone as a guest for a fortnight to a great house where she had a slight connection, and while she was beneath that roof a necklace had gone missing. A famous necklace of emeralds, worth more than everything the Larkfords owned in the world. The household had searched, and the necklace was found wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of Cecily Larkford's own traveling box, where any hand might have laid it, and where her own hand swore before God it never had. It made no difference. The emeralds were real and the box was hers, and 3 respectable people were very sure. She was sent away in disgrace before the assembled house, and the story was in every mouth within the month, and she came home to a failing husband and a daughter of 22, and she did not last the year. She died, the physician said, of a weakness of the heart. Tamsin knew better. She died of shame, which is a thing no physician has ever found a name for, though it kills as many as the fever does. Her father followed within the 12-month of grief, and of the debts the disgrace had called down upon them, and Tamsin was left with a mended shawl and a name that shut every door in England. She had believed her mother innocent while her mother lived. She believed it still. It made not the smallest difference to a single soul, for the belief of a daughter is not evidence, and is not even to most people interesting. Someone had put those emeralds in that box. Tamsin did not know who. She knew only that it was not the woman who had rocked her to sleep and taught her that a kindness was the one coin that never lost its worth. Standing now against the cold pillar, she held to that as she held to the last of her courage, and she counted, slowly, under her breath, for counting was the trick that had kept her upright at the very worst of the 2 years. She had reached the number 7 when the whole room went strange. It began as a change in the sound. The music did not stop, but the talk beneath it faltered, 100 conversations catching at once like a breath held, and then a low, rushing murmur ran through the company from the great doors inward, the way wind runs across a field of standing corn. Heads turned, fans paused. Tamsin, who wished only to be unseen, and so watched everything from her edge, followed the turning of all those heads back toward the doors, and saw that a man had come in whom no one had believed would ever come at all. He stood just within the entrance, tall, and dressed in black that was very fine and wholly without ornament, and he wore a dark traveling cloak still about his shoulders, its high collar turned up against the side of his face. The candlelight by the doors was low, and he kept where it was lowest, so that a person had a strong impression of him, and yet could not have said after what his face was truly like. What a person saw was the stillness of him and the way the crowd drew back without seeming to decide to, opening a space around him as water opens around a stone. And what a person heard, passed hand to hand in that rushing whisper, was who he was. It was the Duke of Aldermere. Tamsin knew the name, as everyone knew it, though she had never thought to set eyes upon the man, for no one did. The Duke of Aldermere was the great recluse of the north. He held one of the oldest titles and one of the largest fortunes in that part of England, and he had not been seen in company for 10 years. He lived shut away at Kelvern Hall, his great cold house out upon the moor, behind gates that did not open, and in the 10 years of his silence, the county had done what a county always does with a silence. It had filled it with stories. Some said he was mad, and kept so by his own people behind the walls. Some said his face had been ruined in a fire long ago, and that he could not bear to be looked upon, and that his temper had been ruined with it, and that he had grown cruel in his solitude, hard and cold and without pity, a man who had turned even his own blood from his door. That was the story most people believed, for it was the most comfortable to believe. There is nothing a society enjoys so much as a great man it is permitted to think a monster. It had called the Duke of Aldermere a monster for 10 years, comfortably, from a safe distance, and here of a sudden the monster stood in the doorway of the Marchford Assembly, and no one knew why. He did not speak to anyone. He did not bow to the room. He stood a long moment while the whole company pretended not to stare, and stared, and his eyes, very dark and very steady, even at that distance, went slowly along the bright, crowded middle of the room, and did not stop there. They went on, past the silk and the candlelight and the people who belonged, all the way out to the cold margin at the edge, and they came to rest upon the one figure that was trying not to be seen. They came to rest upon Tamsin Larkford. And then the Duke of Aldermere, who had not crossed a public room in 10 years, crossed that one. He walked straight down, the length of it through the parting crowd, past the whispering fans and the banked and glowing fires, straight to the pillar at the far edge where a girl stood with a worn shawl turned to the wall. The music had stopped now. Everyone had given up the pretense of not watching. He came to a halt before her, close enough that she had to lift her face to his, and this near she could see him after all. The hard, still features, the dark eyes, and the thin, pale line of an old scar that ran down from the edge of his brow and vanished into the collar of his cloak. He looked at her the way she thought wildly. One looks at a page one has long been searching for. And then he did a thing that no one in that room, recounting it after in 100 astonished drawing rooms, would ever quite be able to explain. He unclasped the dark cloak from his own shoulders and settled it about hers, over the mended shawl, so that the worn gray wool and the twice-mended hem vanished entirely beneath a fall of fine black cloth still warm from him. He did it plainly, without a word, the way a man does a thing he has already decided upon. Then he offered her his arm. Tamsin, who could not have spoken to save her life, who had no notion on earth what was happening or why, laid her hand upon the Duke of Aldermere's sleeve, because there was nothing else in the world to do, and he turned, with the disgraced daughter of a supposed thief upon his arm and his own cloak hiding her poverty from the room, and walked her the whole length of that bright assembly, slowly, in the sight of every soul who had refused to see her, and out through the great doors into the cold. Only at the doors did he speak, low and for her alone. "My carriage will take you home," he said. His voice was quiet and rough at the edges, as a voice is that is not much used. "You will forgive the abruptness. I had a reason to come tonight, and it was you. There is a post I would offer you if you will hear of it. My grandmother wants a companion, and you would suit her. The wages are £40 the year." He paused, and the dark eyes rested on her with that same complete attention. "You need not answer now. The carriage knows the way." And that was all. He handed her up into a warm, dark carriage that stood waiting as though it had always known it would be needed, and shut the door and stepped back. And Tamsin Larkford was carried away through the frozen streets of Marchford wrapped in a duke's cloak, understanding no more of what had befallen her than the moon understands the sea it moves. She did not sleep that night. A post, a companion to his grandmother, £40 the year, which was a fortune to a woman who had lately sold her mother's brooch to a man who knew exactly how little she could afford to refuse him. And yet, she had learned in 2 hard years the first law of her new condition, that nothing is given without a price, and that the gifts which seem the kindest are the ones whose price comes dearest in the end. Why should such a man offer her anything at all? No one who knew her name offered her anything but the far side of a door. There was a reason. He had said so himself, and, not knowing the reason, frightened her more than any plain unkindness could have, for unkindness she understood, and this she did not. But she thought, too, of the cold, and of the doors that had every one of them shut, and of the weight of a warm cloak settling over a mended hem, and the way the whole cruel room had been made for one long walk, to hold its tongue. In the grey of the morning she made the choice a person makes when there is truly no other choice left. She sent word that she would come. Kelvern Hall, when the carriage brought her to it 2 days later, across a wide and empty moor, was not the house she had braced herself to find. She had reasoned that a cruel and shuttered man would live in a cruel and shuttered house, all cold stone, and covered furniture and dead corridors. Kelvern was old and grey and vast. That was true, grown up over centuries out of the hillside without any particular plan. And out here beyond the last village, the wind came off the moor with nothing to break it. But the windows were lit. Smoke went up straight from a dozen chimneys into the still, cold air. And when the carriage drew into the courtyard, the door opened before she had gathered herself to knock, and a housekeeper with a kind and anxious face came bustling down the steps herself to take the small cold box from Tamsin's hands, as though it were a thing of value. This was Mrs. Orrell, who clucked and drew her in out of the wind before she had rightly got her breath, and took her up a great worn staircase to a room where a fire was already lit and burning well, banked and settled, as though it had been lit a full hour before and tended since. Tamsin stopped on the threshold and looked at it. "Was I expected so exactly?" she asked. "The fire is His Grace's order, miss," said Mrs. Orrell, and something crossed her kind face as she said it, some private wondering of her own that she did not share. "He came up himself this morning to see it lit and to see that it drew. He does not often come to the guest rooms. I could not tell you why he took the trouble. He does not tell anyone why he takes any trouble that he takes. But he took it." Then she was gone, and Tamsin stood alone before a fire that had been lit for her by the order of a duke, in a warm room in a warm house on the coldest edge of the world, and could not for a long moment make any sense of it. In 2 years, no one had lit a fire for her before she asked. She had forgotten there were still places where such a thing was simply done, quietly, so that the coming was warm. She met the Dowager Duchess that same evening, and the Dowager, at least, made a kind of sense. She was a very old woman, past 80, small and upright, in a great chair by a great fire, with white hair dressed high, and a sharp-lined face and pale eyes that had gone nearly blind, so that she turned her head a little sideways to listen where another would have looked. She missed nothing for all that. She made up in words for every word her grandson failed to speak, talking from the moment Tamsin entered in a dry running commentary upon everything and everyone. And it took Tamsin some while to understand that the talk was a kindness, that the old woman had heard the fright in her step and was covering it, giving her time, asking nothing of her but that she sit and let the words wash over her, until she stopped, trembling. "I will tell you the part I can tell, which is my part," the old woman said at last, setting down her cup with the small, sure click of long practice. "The rest you must have of my grandson, if you can get it, which I doubt, for getting anything from Leander is like getting water from a stone, and I have been at the stone above 30 years. I am old and difficult, and I have driven off 3 companions in 2 years, the last of them in tears, which I am not proud of. My grandson is weary of the trouble of replacing them. He found you. That is the whole of my part. Whether you will suit me, I have no notion, and whether I shall suit you, I have less. But you are here, and it is winter, and neither of us has anywhere better to be. We may as well try each other." Then she turned her nearly sightless eyes toward Tamsin with an uncanny accuracy, and said, more gently, "I know your name, child. I knew it when he named you to me. I know the whole of the tale they'd tell of your mother." And she said nothing further of it at all, which was its own kind of answer, and turned the talk to the moor and the cold, and Tamsin understood that she had come up against the edge of the part the Dowager Duchess would tell, and that the rest lay somewhere in the silence of a man she had not yet truly met. So began her first days at Kelvern, and they were the strangest of her life, for she spent them waiting for the price to be named, and the price did not come. She kept the old lady company through the long gray hours, and read to her, and walked her small errands, and watched all the while, the way a person watches who has been taught what kindness costs. She watched for the moment the warmth would turn, for the demand behind the courtesy, the catch hidden in the lit fire, and the good plain food set before her without stint. The catch did not come. Kindness followed kindness, and no price was ever named, because, though she could not yet bring herself to believe it, there was no price. She began, slowly, against every hard lesson of the 2 years behind her, to wonder if she had come at last to a place where a kindness might be only a kindness, and the wondering frightened her more than a price would have. For a price she understood. This she did not understand at all. We will pause here for a short while. If you would like to know what Tamsin found waiting behind the walls of Kelvern Hall, and what manner of man the Duke of Aldermere truly was beneath the stories, do subscribe to the channel so that the next part of this tale finds its way to you. She came, in those first weeks, to learn the house, and by the shape of the house she began, without meaning to learn the man. The first thing she learned surprised her, for she had imagined a shuttered duke as a man who did nothing but brood behind his walls. The Duke of Aldermere did not brood, or if he did it while doing a great deal else. He worked quietly and constantly at the running of a great estate and much besides, from a study whose door most often stood open and whose quiet was never an idle quiet. Letters went out from Kelvern by the dozen, and with the letters, though it was never spoken of, money went, a great deal of money, running out into the county along 100 quiet channels. And Tamsin, who had the run of the house and the freedom of the old lady's errands, began to see in glimpses where the money went. She saw the first of it by accident, in her 3rd week, on a raw gray morning when she had gone down to the kitchen court. There was a young woman there she had not seen before, a girl of perhaps 16, thin and quiet, peeling roots at the long table. And when Mrs. Orrell spoke to her, she flinched before she answered, the flinch of a person who has been much shouted at. Later, drawn by some carefulness in the girl's face, Tamsin fell into talk with her, and learned her name was Prudence, and learned her story, told in a low voice with her eyes upon her work, the way a person speaks of a wound not yet healed. Prudence had been a housemaid at a good house not 10 miles off, and a brooch had gone missing from a lady's room. And because Prudence was poor and new and friendless, it was Prudence who was blamed. She had been turned out without a character, which for a servant girl is the same as being turned out to starve, for no house will take a maid dismissed for theft, and there is nothing after that but the road, or the workhouse, or worse. She had not taken the brooch. It was found a month after behind the lady's own dressing table, where it had fallen, but by then Prudence was long gone, and no one troubled to send word after a dismissed girl to tell her she was clear. "And how did you come to Kelvern?" Tamsin asked her, and the girl looked up with something like wonder still upon her face, and said she did not rightly know. A man had come to the poor lodging where she was starving out her last few shillings, a lawyer's man with no name he would give, and had told her a place was open in the kitchens of a great house that did not ask for a character, and here she was, warm and fed, and she had never once set eyes upon the master, and did not know why he should trouble over a ruined kitchen girl he had never seen. It was not until that night, lying awake, that the whole shape of the thing came to Tamsin, and it took her breath. A girl ruined by a false charge of theft, friendless, nameless, past all help, quietly found and quietly saved by a hand that took the greatest care never to be seen or thanked. It was her own tale. It was her mother's tale. And the Duke of Aldermere, who had never met Prudence and might never trouble to, had reached out into the dark and lifted the girl out of it, for no reason Tamsin could name, unless it were that he could not bear to see that one particular wrong go unmended in the world. She saw him do such a thing with her own eyes only once, and never forgot it. It was a hard frozen morning late in her 2nd month, and she had gone out toward the home farm on an errand, and there was a knot of men in the yard, and a boy of the village held between two of them, white and shaking, a lad of 13 or so, caught before dawn with a snared hare in the Kelvern woods. It was no small matter. A man might be transported for less, sent to the far side of the world and never seen again, and the boy knew it and stood there in the cold waiting to be handed over to the law. The keeper who held him was working himself toward the anger of a man who means to make an example. Then the Duke came into the yard silent, and everyone fell quiet, waiting for the master's judgment, which everyone supposed would be hard, for the master was a hard man. He did not speak. He looked at the boy a long moment with the dark eyes. He looked at the snare, and at the boy's bare feet gone blue with cold, and at the thinness of him. Then he took the hare from the keeper's hand, and gave it back into the boy's, and set his own hand a moment upon the shaking shoulder, and turned him toward the gate, and let him go. And he wrote a line upon a card, and gave it to the keeper. And Tamsin learned after what it said. It said the boy was to be taken on at the home farm at a proper wage, and that a family whose child must poach to eat was a family the estate had failed, and that the failing would be mended. No one was punished. No one was shamed. A frightened boy was simply, wordlessly, saved and set upon a better road, and the whole of it done without a single spoken word. She came upon it again and again, after that, once she had learned to see it. And she met one of them face to face, some weeks on, walking the old lady's errands to the village through a thin, cold rain. He was an old man named Barrow, a tenant whose barn had burned in the dry of the autumn, and he spoke of his trouble to her, not knowing who she was or where she lodged, the way country people speak of a wonder. His barn had gone up and his whole year's grain with it, he said, and he had lain awake a week waiting for the agent to come and turn him off, for he was 2 quarters behind his rent and knew the law. The agent had come, but the agent had brought a paper that forgave the 2 quarters and 2 years more besides, and never a word of who had ordered it. Some fund, the old man said, and shook his white head. They told me it was a fund, but there is no fund walks a man's fields before light to see his new barn frame square, and I've seen him do it, miss. The tall, dark one that never shows his face nor says aught, out in my field in the gray before dawn, looking up at my roof tree, and gone again before I could get my boots on to thank him. A fund. He laughed and wiped his eyes, and was not ashamed of it. I will tell you what I think. I think there is a man hereabouts does more good than any 10 that preach it, and has took some hurt that keeps him from letting on. I put him in my prayers by no name at all, for I have none to give him. I reckon the Almighty knows the one I mean. Tamsin walked home with that in her, and it did not leave her. She had come to Kelvern believing herself the only soul in the county who owed this silent man a debt she could not name. She saw now that she was one of a great company, scattered through the villages and the cold farms and the back lanes, a whole quiet multitude of the saved, every one of them lifted out of the dark by a hand, not one of them could think, every one of them putting a nameless man into their prayers by no name at all, and not one of them knowing that the man they blessed had a name and a title, and a ruined face, and a house upon the moor where he sat alone and did in silence the good he would not speak of. It was a strange thing to find oneself one of a company one had thought oneself alone in. It was a warm thing, too, on the cold walk home across the white moor, and it did not leave her. And there was, she had begun to notice, one room at Kelvern that was always locked. It was a small door off the long gallery plain, a door a person would pass 100 times and never mark, save that she had once seen Mrs. Orrell try the handle out of the habit of her dusting, and find it fast, and move on with the smallest shake of her head, as at a thing long understood and never questioned. No servant went in, no servant had the key. She asked Mrs. Orrell of it once lightly, and the good woman's face closed as a door closes. "That is the master's own room, miss," she said, "and no one goes there but himself, not these 10 years, and it is not my place nor yours to wonder why." And she would say no more. But whatever the Duke of Aldermere kept behind that one plain locked door in all his open house, he kept it from every eye but his own, and Tamsin, who was learning that this was a man who hid only the things that had cost him most, found that her own eyes went to that door whenever she passed it, and that she wondered, and that the wondering would not let her be. Twice she passed it late and saw a thin line of candlelight beneath it, and heard nothing at all, and went on, and did not sleep well after. She spoke of the silence once to the Dowager Duchess, carefully, and the old woman was quiet a long while before she answered. "He does not like to be thanked," she said at last. "I would have you understand. It is not modesty, for you will be tempted to think it modesty, and it is not. It is a harder thing. He does not believe that anything of his which is only said is worth the having. Not his thanks, not his word, not any spoken thing at all. So he gives things that are real instead. A roof is real, bread is real, a place at a school is real. These are things a man may do without opening his mouth to a world he has stopped trusting, and my grandson has come to trust only the things a man may do, without opening his mouth. Her pale eyes turned toward the fire. He was not always so. That is the part you do not know, and I will not tell it you, for it is his to tell, and he will not tell it either, so there we are. But he was not always so. Once he was the most open-hearted boy that ever lived, and he talked, and oh, how he believed. He believed that if you only told people the truth, they must in the end hear it. Something cured him of that belief. I was there when it happened. I have watched him pay for it every day of 10 years, and I would give the rest of my life to undo it. And I cannot, for the only soul who can undo it is himself, and he has stopped believing there is any use in the trying. And then, the old woman shut her mouth on it, hard as a person shuts a book they should not have opened, and would say no more that night, and Tamsin carried the little she had been given up to her cold bed, and lay turning it over, no nearer the heart of him, and wanting, though she would not yet have owned the word to be. It was in a library that she came to know him, in the end, or as near to knowing him as he would then allow. She had been given the freedom of that room on her first morning by a means she would only later understand. She had risen early, unable to sleep in so strange a bed, and gone down in the last gray dark to find the book she had been told she might use, and had found the library, a long high room with a gallery running round it, and more books in it than she had seen since her father's own small good collection was sold at the door of their old house, had never owed. She had stood among them and felt something in her chest come loose that had been held tight for 2 years. And then she had turned, and the Duke of Aldermere was standing in the doorway watching her, and she had not heard him come, for he moved as quietly as he did all things. In the gray light his face was half in shadow, the scarred side turned from her, and he had looked at her a long moment with those dark, steady eyes, taking in the whole of her, the mended gown, and the straight back, and the 2 hard years written plain in her face, and setting it all down somewhere, careful within himself, the way she might mark a passage to return to. Then he had crossed to a table, and taken up a book that lay ready there, and set it in her hands, and gone out, all without a word. And when he had gone, she had opened it, and found a single line written on the flyleaf, in a spare upright hand. "This room is yours at this hour. No one will trouble you here but me, and I will not." So it began, the strangest and the truest courtship of her life, though neither of them would have given it that name for a long while yet, and though not one word of the beginning of it was ever spoken aloud by him. It went forward, at the last gray hour of the afternoon, in the failing light before the lamps were lit, in the library that had become, without a thing being said, the country of the 2 of them. She had thought at first to keep out of his way there, but she found he did not mind her presence, that he sought it, coming in at his hour, to find her already there, and settling to his own, reading a little apart, the 2 of them silent together in the dying light. It should have been uncomfortable. It was not. She had never in her life been so easy in a silence. And by degrees they came to talk, after a fashion, which is to say that she talked, and he wrote. She would say a thing about the book in her hands, some argument she quarreled with, some passage that had struck her to the heart, and he would listen with that whole grave attention, and then he would write a line upon the fly-leaf of whatever book lay nearest, and pass it across, and she would read it and answer it aloud, and he would write again. His written lines were dry and exact, and often, to her great surprise, very funny. Wah! She had been reading a solemn old volume upon the duties of the great, and said half to herself that the man who wrote it had plainly never been great a day in his life, or he would have known that duty is a good deal easier to write of than to do. The Duke took up his pen and wrote and passed the book back. He was a bishop, it said. They are great in the one way that costs a man nothing. She laughed aloud, the first time she had laughed aloud in that house or any house for 2 years, and the sound of it surprised them both, and she said that was unkind and very probably true. And did he never think well of anyone at all? He wrote, seldom, it spares me the disappointment. And then, after a moment, weighing it, a second line beneath the first. I make a few exceptions. They are more trouble than the rule. I am told they are worth it. He did not look at her while she read that one. He looked into the fire, and Tamsin looked at the line of spare upright writing, and found she could not answer it aloud, and instead of handing the book back, she closed it quietly and kept it, and took it up to her room that night, and set it in the drawer of her dressing table, and could not have told a living soul why. She kept them, after that, the books he marked for her. A small and growing stack, each with its line or two of dry writing in the margin, the half-spoken and half-written conversation of a man who set down only what he meant, for a man who must write a thing in ink, does not write it lightly, and everything the Duke of Aldermere wrote to her was considered, and honest, and meant. There was one evening she treasured above the rest. She had been reading of a shipwreck and had said, the thing that frightened her most in the account was not the storm, but the calm after, the survivors on the shore with everything gone and no notion how to begin again. He was still a long while. Then he wrote, one begins by lighting a fire and boiling water. The great labors are got through an hour at a time, or not at all. I have found it answers. And she understood that he was not speaking of shipwrecks, and that he had told her in a dozen words upon a flyleaf more of how he had lived his 10 years than he had ever told a living soul. And she kept that book closest of all. She told herself she kept them because they were the nearest thing she had to conversation in that quiet house. But it was more than that, and she knew it was more than that, and the knowing frightened her in the old way, the way the lit fire had frightened her, because it meant she was coming to want something again, and she had learned 2 years before precisely what came of wanting. There came to Kelvern in that season a visitor, a Mrs. Pardew, a county lady, who called upon the dowager twice a year, out of a duty she plainly enjoyed, stayed too long, and knew a very great deal about everyone. She looked at Tamsin with a frank and hungry curiosity, made her small remarks, and worked her way over the tea toward the subject she had truly come for. Of course, she said comfortably, settling her cup. They do say the Duke is not quite, and here she tapped her own temple with one finger and smiled. One hears such things. The silence. You know it is not natural in a man. My own husband says a man who will not show his face to the world has something upon it he dares not have seen, and a matching thing in his heart, 10 years shut away out here. It is not wholesome. And that poor mad creature keeping all this from his own blood, they say, turning his own cousins from the door. Tamsin set down her cup. She had not meant to speak. She heard herself speak. Your husband is mistaken, she said, and her own steadiness surprised her. I have lived beneath this roof some months. In that time I have known of a ruined kitchen girl kept from the road, and a burned tenant kept in his farm, and a drowned man's widow kept from the workhouse, and a poor boy sent to his schooling, and every last part of it done by a hand that labored above all else never to be seen and never to be thanked. That is not the mark of a man with something he dares not have seen. It is the mark of a man who has decided that saying is cheap and doing is dear, and has chosen, at whatever cost to himself, the dearer of the two. I would there were more such men and fewer who tap their brows over the tea and call it conversation. There was a silence. Mrs. Pardew's smile went stiff upon her face. Across the room the Dowager Duchess made a small sound into her needlework that might have been a cough and was not, and Tamsin, her heart going hard, understood 2 things at once. That she had been unforgivably rude to a guest in another woman's house, and that she had meant every word and would say it all again. What she did not understand then was that she had done in that room the very thing that had been done once 10 years before, for her own mother, by the very man she had risen to defend. She had stood in a comfortable room full of comfortable people and spoken a truth that was not wanted in defense of someone who was not there to defend themselves, against the easy cruelty of those who had decided a thing and did not care to be troubled with the facts of it. She did not know she was standing in his own footprints. She would come to know it. And she did not know, that evening, that he heard of what she had said, though he heard of most things at Kelvern, and that there was a change in him after it, small and deep like the first give of ice in a long frost. But a frost that has held 10 years does not give without someone marking it. And there was one in that county who marked everything, and to whom the news that the Duke of Aldermere had broken his 10 years' silence to walk a disgraced girl the length of the Marchford Assembly came, not as a wonder, but as a warning. Her name was Drusilla, and she was the Countess of Vale, and she was, in her own portion of the world, as much its ruler as the Duke was master of his. She was a handsome woman still, near 50, with a smooth, unlined face and a pleasant, cold smile, and a manner so gracious that people did not at first understand they had been cut until they were already bleeding. She had built her whole life upon her name, and her standing and the great warm reputation of her house, and she guarded all three the way a lioness guards her young, and for the same reason, for they were the whole of what she had. The Dowager Duchess had a letter of her one grey morning, and Tamsin, reading it aloud at the old lady's word, felt the room change before she understood why. For the Countess wrote, in the kindest terms in the world, to say how very interested she had been to hear that dear Lady Aldermere had taken a young companion, and what a charitable heart it showed, and how she hoped the girl was quite what she seemed. One heard such sad things, and she did so look forward to meeting Miss Larkford herself before the winter was out. The old woman sat very still when the letter was done. Then she said in a voice gone hard and low, "Put that in the fire, child, and think no more of it tonight." But her nearly sightless eyes had turned toward the window and the white moor beyond it, as though she saw, out there in the coming dark, a thing approaching that she had hoped never to see again. And Tamsin, folding the letter with fingers that were not quite steady, understood that she had passed some winter of quiet and warmth and marked books, and that it was ending, and that whatever the Countess of Vale wanted with the ruined daughter of Cecily Larkford, it had nothing of kindness in it at all. The frost held into February, and hardened, and something harder than the frost came creeping toward the moor with it, for the Countess of Vale had turned her smooth face north, and where that face turned, a coldness followed. Tamsin felt the county drawing back from Kelvern by inches, a greeting not returned, a caller who found some reason not to climb the hill, and she could not yet name the whole of it, only that a shadow had reached the house. It was the Dowager Duchess who put the name to it, or rather to the man, which came in the end to the same thing. A bright, hard morning found the old woman in a fierce and reckless humor, and she turned her clouded eyes toward the sound of Tamsin's breathing and spoke with no gentle beginning at all. "You have gone all winter not knowing why he sent for you," she said, "and it has worn a groove in you, and I have watched it wear. I mean to break a promise I made him, for I am past my 80th year, and I have earned the right to spend a broken word or two before the end of me. I would rather you did a foolish thing knowing than a worse one. Blind, sit down. This is not a standing tale." She laid aside the needlework she could no longer see, and worked only from the memory of her fingers, and gave it plainly, the way a tired person lays a weight down at last. 10 years passed, my grandson was 22, she said, and there breathed no gentler fool upon the earth, for he held the belief that only the young can afford, that a true thing spoken plainly must in the end be believed. There was a girl in this house then. Linnet was her name, the orphan of a poor cousin taken in at 7 and raised at Leander's shoulder, penniless as a wren and dearer to him than his own breath, the sister his blood never gave him. And there came an autumn when we were guests in a great house, and in that house lay a famous rope of emeralds, and a night came when those emeralds were found folded away in Linnet's own linen, where no honest hand of hers had put them. Tamsin made a small sound she could not help, and the old woman inclined her head toward it. "Yes," she said, You feel the shape of it. It is your mother's story laid down twice, and I am coming to the reason it rhymes so. Linnet had no more taken those stones than swallowed the moon. But she was poor and friendless, and the emeralds were in her keeping, and the lady of that house was very great and very sweet in her certainty, and a girl with nothing was ruined between one candle and the next. And my grandson rose to his feet. He was 22, and he loved her, and he stood before the whole shining company, and gave them the truth entire, the innocence of the girl and the guilt of the woman, with the whole of his open heart, and named the name, before every soul who might have saved her had they wished to. The old hands went still, and they were amused, she said, and her voice thinned to something terrible in its evenness. That is the thing that unmade him, child. Not that they disbelieved, that they were entertained. A boy with nothing but his own 2 eyes for proof, defending a pauper against a countess at the height of her glory, struck them as the choicest sport of the season. So the very speaking he had meant to lift her clear became another stone tied to her, for they said, "Only look, the creature has no friend in the world save one wild, besotted boy, which is as good as her confession." His truth did not save her, it helped to sink her. She drew a breath, and the flat voice cracked. And that same night, she said, a fire took the wing where Linnet slept, set, I have always known, to silence the one witness who could have undone the lie. For the child had seen more than she understood, and Linnet was caught in it. Leander went in after her through the smoke, and was dragged out at the last with her already gone in his arms, and the side of his face and the back of his hand were burned near to the bone where he had turned to shield her. He did not speak of anything much. After, he had given the world a truth with his whole heart, and watched it do murder, and watched it take a life he loved and half his own face in a single night, and he closed his mouth upon the world and did not open it again. That is the wound. In 10 years he has not once believed a spoken word of his worth the air it cost, and so he stopped spending them, and does in silence the good he dares not say, and all the while he has waited. Waited for what? Tamsin asked, though the answer was already rising in her. For wait, said the old woman, for the proof and the record that no room full of amused people could laugh into nothing. He has spent 10 years gathering in silence what he could not gather in a night, so that her name might one day be given back, though she is 10 years in her grave and past the needing of it. And 2 years ago, she said, turning her blind eyes full upon Tamsin, that same sweet and terrible woman did the thing again, to another gentle, friendless creature who had strayed too near her secret. She did it to your mother. My grandson knew the hand the instant he heard of it, and knew Cecily Larkford as guiltless as Linnet had been, and he said not one word. He was 10 years deep in his silence, and had learned in the cruelest school that his speaking could not save the innocent, and might help to bury them, and so he held his tongue, and your mother died with the lie still on her. When word reached him this winter that her daughter was in the county, turned from every door, he did the only thing a mute man can do. He unbarred his own gate. That is why a fire burned in your room before ever you asked for one. It was not the welcome of an employer. It was the confession of a debtor. There, I have broken my word, and I am glad of it, and you will do now whatever the knowing bids you do. Tamsin sat a long while in the cold, bright room after the telling was done, and a great many things she had puzzled over came quietly into their places. The debt she had glimpsed in his dark eyes that first gray morning, the care that no gift should ever be traced to a giver, the whole grieving architecture of the silence. And she understood, with an ache that emptied her, what it meant for her, that every kindness of that warm winter, the cloak over her shawl, the fire before the asking, the marked books she had gathered like a miser, had never once been meant for her. They were offerings to 2 dead women, laid at the feet of a guilt 10 years deep. She had not been a person to him at all. She had been an account left open no more than Prudence at the kitchen table, or old barrow in his rebuilt barn, one more wrong he could not leave standing. And somewhere across that winter of banked fires and dry, inked lines, she had given her heart to a man who did not know it and never would. The most wasted love a woman ever spent, poured out upon a man who believed himself only to be balancing an old and bitter ledger. It was a bitter knowing, for pride was the last coin she had, and there is little more bitter to a proud woman than to love a man whose whole tenderness is an apology owed to her mother. For a day and a night she believed the one bearable course was to go, to keep the last of her pride, and stop taking a charity that was truly a penance to the dead. And then she found she could not. What held her was not weakness, nor even the love, though the love was tangled through it. It was that all winter she had learned to see clean past the debt to the man who carried it. And the man was the greater thing, by far greater than the debt and than what was left of her pride. She could not turn from a man shut inside 10 years of silence over a wound no living soul had ever tried to heal, when she was, perhaps, the one creature now breathing who might. She had come to Kelvern to be lifted out of the cold, and she stayed because she had begun to believe that she alone might be the one to thaw him, and to a woman stripped of everything that was richer than any wage, to hold in her hands a gift no one else on earth could give. There came a night that same month that changed the weather between them, though not a word was spoken, for between the two of them words were never the currency. A blizzard came down off the high moor without warning in the last of the daylight, the kind that kills a grown man in an hour, and at dusk word came up that Prudence's small brother, a shepherd's lad of 10, had not come down with the flock and was out in the white somewhere. The Duke was gone before the sentence was finished, out into the driving dark with 2 men and a lantern, and Tamsin, who could not sit warm while a child went cold in the snow, did the one thing left for her hands. She heaped the great hall fire until it roared, set water and stones and blankets to warm, and carried a lamp to the tall black window and held it steady to the glass through all the long hours, so that in the whole of that howling dark there should be one unwavering light for a lost man to steer home by. She never knew if he saw it. She held it there all the same. It was close on dawn when they came, 3 staggering shapes out of the paling storm, and the Duke had the boy buttoned inside his own coat, and the child was the color of ash and scarcely breathing. They worked over him together on the hearthrug in the blaze of the fire, and there was no room in it for words and no need of any. She had the warmed blankets and heated stones to hand, and he chafed the small blue fingers between his scarred ones, and by slow degrees the gray went out of the child, and the breath came back and steadied, and in the first true light the boy sighed, and turned in his sleep like any other child, and was safe. And Tamsin lifted her eyes and found the Duke already watching her across the sleeping boy, not the child, her, with the whole of that winter in his dark eyes, and no book to shelter behind, and no shadow left to hide his face in. He did not look away. Neither did she. Then the boy stirred, and the spell closed itself over. But it had been, and both of them had been there for the being of it, and whatever they said of it after, which was nothing, it stood from that dawn between them like a small lit thing, that neither would name and neither could put out. And in the days that followed, while Tamsin held that light close and told no one, the shadow off the moor came nearer, for the Countess of Vale had not been idle, and the worst of the winter had not yet come. She reached for the oldest weapon there is, which is a young woman's good name, and the whole cruelty of it lay in how little labor it cost her. A girl unmarried, living beneath the roof of an unwed duke, and that duke, the mad and ruined recluse of every fireside tale in the county, wanted only to be named once, in the right low voice, with the right small breath of a sigh, and the naming did all the rest of its own accord. It weighed nothing that the dowager kept her rooms at Kelvern, that every propriety was observed, that Tamsin was a paid companion and no more. The Countess named it. She named it graciously, all reluctance and regret, with a soft sorrowing sigh, in a dozen bright drawing rooms across the county, that it was a pity, Such a very great pity that the Larkford girl, whatever one might think of the mother, should have flung away the last poor shred of her good name, going to live so very strangely with a man of whom one heard such dreadful things, and she let the sigh do the labor. Inside a month the tale had gone everywhere, and it was no longer a duke's charity to a wronged woman's child. It was a scandal, open and eager, and had fastened upon Tamsin exactly as the first disgrace had fastened upon Cecily, and it did the work it had been built for. It made her presence at Kelvern a thing that must, in the end, ruin, not her alone, but the old woman she served and the man who had taken her in. She came to know of it as a person comes to know of such things. A look here, a letter left unanswered there, a chill where warmth had been, and then, in one cruel afternoon, all at once, she had driven out with the dowager to a house where the old lady had been made welcome for 50 years, and the door was opened, and the daughter of the house came herself to the carriage, pink and wretched, to say that her mother was not within. The dowager duchess, past 80, who had not been refused a door in the whole span of her long life, sat straight as a rod and said nothing at all until they were down the drive and away. Then she spoke, and her old voice shook with a fury Tamsin had never heard in it. "So we are come to this," she said. "They will bar their doors against me, at my years, upon a lie, sooner than bar them against Drusilla Vale." And underneath the fury, Tamsin heard the wound, and knew with a sick certainty that she herself was the cause of it, that her staying was undoing the one person who had shown her nothing but plain kindness, and that the honorable thing, the only decent thing, was the very thing she had refused a month before. It was to leave. She went to him that evening. In all the winter she had never once sought him out to speak of a thing that mattered. She sought him now. He was in his study, the door standing open, the candles lit, the spare upright hand moving across a sheet, and he looked up as she came in, and something moved across the hard, still face and was mastered before it could be read. She stood in the doorway and made herself say the whole of it plainly, because he was a man who trusted only what was real, and a plain truth plainly given was the realest offering she had left. "You must let me go," she said. "You know what is being said, and by whom. Your grandmother was turned from a door today, at 80, after 50 years of welcome, and the cause of it was me. That woman means to ruin the three of us together, and she will manage it, for a lie in the right mouth has no answer. I know now why you brought me here. Your grandmother has told me, all of it, Linnet and my mother and what you did and what it took from you. This was never a place of work. It was a debt, and you have overpaid it many times, and I give you back the rest of it freely. You owe my mother nothing further, and you never owed me anything at all. Let me go, and let the talk go out of the county on my heels, and keep your grandmother her doors and yourself your peace. It is the last good I can do any of you, and I am asking you to let me do it." The silence that answered her was unlike any silence of that winter. She watched his scarred hand move toward the pen out of 10 years of iron habit, and she watched it stop, and settle, and lie still. And she understood that a great struggle was going forward behind the dark, quiet eyes, the struggle of a man who has answered the whole world in ink for a decade, and is faced at last with a thing that ink will not answer. He rose. He came around the desk and stood close before her, so that she must lift her face to his. And then the Duke of Aldemir did what he had done for no living creature in 10 years. He turned the ruined side of his face full into the candlelight, the side he kept forever to the shadow, and he let her see the whole of it, unhidden, the wreck the fire had made of him the night he could not save a girl he loved, and he held it there, in the light, before her eyes, and did not flinch from her looking. And then he spoke, and his voice came low and rough with long disuse, and every word of it plainly cost him. "Look at it," he said. "You have wished to, and been too kind to. Look, this is the price the truth set on me. The one time in my life I told it whole. For 10 years I called the silence after prudence, and told myself a burned man had at last grown wise. It was never wisdom. It was that I could not bear to stand in a bright room and be laughed at over a grave a second time. You have made that fear look very small this winter. I will not give you over to Drusilla Vale to keep my quiet. I would sooner she took the other side of my face than sit one more hour in the shadow and watch her bury a woman that I—" He stopped there, on the edge of the word, and did not step over it, and it hung between them larger for being unsaid. "This ceased to be your mother's debt inside the first week," he said, "and I let you go on believing otherwise, because a debt asks nothing of a man's heart, and I was a coward with mine. I am finished with the cowardice. Go up. I have letters to write tonight, and for the first time in 10 years I find I know exactly what I mean to say, and precisely where I mean at last to say it." She could not answer him. She, who had done all the talking of that whole long winter, stood in the door of his study with no word anywhere in her, and he saw it. And something moved at the ruined corner of his mouth that was very nearly the ghost of a smile. "You find it is not so easy," he said, more quietly, "when the turn is your own. Go up now." And Tamsin went, with her heart going like a hammer, and no notion in the world what he meant to do, only that a frost 10 years unbroken had cracked clean through at last, and that whatever came of the breaking would come soon. The great winter ball of the county fell that year under the roof of Vale Court itself, for it pleased the Countess once each winter to gather the whole county beneath her own ceiling and reign over it a night as its queen unquestioned. That year they came alight with the tale of the Larkford girl and the monster of the moor, and Drusilla Vale came down her broad staircase certain, at the peak of her strength, that the game was already won. She had cause to be. The girl was twice disgraced, the old aunt shut from her doors, and the Duke of Aldermere could no more shield them than he had ever shielded anyone, for it was known past doubting that he did not speak, that whatever the rights of the matter he would keep to the edge of the room, his ruined face to the shadow, and let the current carry the girl under. The whole of her certainty rested upon the silence of the Duke of Aldermere, which had never once failed her, and was the surest thing in England. Tamsin had not wished to come. He had asked it of her, aloud in his rough new-mended voice, and she had found she could deny him nothing when the asking cost him such hard-won words. So she came upon the dowager's arm into the long, bright rooms thronged with the very people who had barred their doors, and she kept her spine straight and waited for the cut. And the cut came, from 100 quarters at once, the shoulders turning smoothly away, the little tide of space widening around her as a round something plague-marked. She stood in it. She had stood in it before. She set her eyes on the far wall, and beside her the dowager stood too, fierce and upright and old, the pair of them marooned on their cold island, while the ball glittered past. And from the head of her own great staircase, Drusilla Vale looked down and smiled her sweet and gracious smile. And then, from the shadowed edge of the room where every soul present had forgotten him, the Duke of Aldermere moved and stepped forward out of the dark, and walked into the light. At the first, they did not understand what they were seeing. They saw the silent Duke, whom they had half forgotten was even in the house, cross the long, bright floor, and they parted before him from old habit and supposed him bound for the door or for some quiet word with his aunt. He came instead to where Tamsin stood, and took his place at her side in the ring of cold space, so that the space now enclosed a duke, and to keep it open suddenly cost the keeper something. And then he turned to face the whole assembly, and did not keep to the shadow, but stood full in the blaze of the great chandelier, where every eye could find him plainly, the ruin of his face bare and unhidden, before the county for the first time in a decade, and he addressed them aloud. "I ask your patience," said the Duke of Aldermere, and the voice came rough, and then found its feet, and carried down the room into a hush that dropped like a sheet let fall. "I am long out of the practice of speaking, as you are all so fond of remarking. You have had great pleasure of my silence these 10 years, and named it madness, and pride, and worse. I will tell you at last what it truly was. His eyes went once to Tamsin, then out over the sea of faces. 10 years ago, under this roof, an innocent girl was destroyed for a theft she never touched. Her name was Lynette. She had no fortune and no defender on earth but me, and I was 22, and I stood up in this house and told you plainly that she was guiltless, and that another hand had taken the emeralds and let her carry the shame. And you found me amusing. Some of you laughing here tonight laughed at me. Then you called me a besotted boy, and made a rope of my defending her, to hang her with. And before that night was out, she was dead in a fire, lit to silence her, for good, and I carried her out of it too late, and I have worn the mark of that fire on my face ever since, at which you have all wondered so long, and at which you may now look your fill. A stir ran the length of the room. He let it run itself out. I took your lesson to heart that night, he went on, that under a roof like this one, a truth is worth nothing, unless it comes so heavy with proof that not the boldest of you can laugh it into air. So I fell silent, and stayed silent 10 years, and did in the dark what I could not do in the light, and gathered the weight one patient stone upon another until I had enough of it, and here it is. From within his coat he drew a thick packet of papers and held it up, and the whole bright room went to stone. The woman who took the veil emeralds and sold them across the water to bury her husband's debts, he said, and had paste set in their place, and cried theft twice over to smother the truth, and let 2 innocent women carry the blame into their graves, is the lady of this house. It is Drusilla, Countess of Vale. I hold the proof of it in my hand, the jeweler's own record of the sale, the letter of the man she paid to counterfeit the stones, 10 winters in the gathering. I did not use it while her husband lived, for I make no war upon the dead, and I judged it kinder to the living daughter to let the grave stay shut. In that I was wrong, and this winter has taught me my error, for there is one thing worse than a hard truth spoken. It is a healing truth, locked away out of fear and called wisdom by the frightened man who keeps it. Cecily Larkford was innocent. Lynette was innocent. The daughter beside me tonight is innocent, and has been used more cruelly by this county than any of you will care to remember tomorrow, and I will stand for her now as I could not once stand for the others. The hush that fell then was of the worst kind there is, worse than any uproar, and it settled over the bright rooms and would not lift. Alone at the head of her own staircase, Drusilla Vale stood with the sweet smile gone at last from her mouth, and one by one the whole assembly turned to look up at her. She had raised the whole of her life over a buried thing, and it lay unburied now in a steady scarred hand before everyone whose regard she had ever courted, and no gracious sigh could cover it, and no cold shoulder turn it away. She looked, in that moment, not like the mistress of anything, but like a woman who had kept watch over a locked grave 10 years, and stood by, helpless as it was broken open. She said nothing, for there was nothing left to say. She turned and went from the room, through the parting ranks of her own guests, alone, and in the weeks after, the doors of the county swung shut behind her one by one, as they had once swung shut on Tamsin, who found no gladness in it, only the old tired justice of a hidden thing risen into the light. The names were cleared that spring, in the sober forms, on the proper papers, in a quiet room, and not a loud one, for the loud part was long over. It took lawyers and patience and the full weight of a duke behind it, and at the end there lay 2 plain documents that said, in the dry words of such things, that Cecily Larkford and the girl called Lynette had each been wrongfully accused and stood cleared of any wrong, and that their good names were restored to them and their heirs. Tamsin held her mother's in her hands in the Kelvern library at the grey hour, with the Duke beside her, and read the cold words that gave her back the thing torn from her, and the weeping came that she had schooled herself out of across 2 long years. He did not reach for a card, nor, for once, take shelter in his silence. He put his scarred arm around her and held her while she wept, and let the quiet be the whole of his answer, and it was the fullest and kindest quiet of all that winter. She never saw it restored, Tamsin said when the words would come. You have given her name back, and she is not living to be given it. She went to her grave believing she had failed, that her whole blameless life had come to nothing, and left her girl a poisoned name and not a friend in the world. He was quiet a moment. She did not go believing that, he said, and it was the first Tamsin had ever heard of it. I could not clear her 2 years since. I had neither the proof nor the courage, and I will carry that to my grave. But I sent her one thing before the end, a single line, unsigned, in a hand she would not know, that said only that one soul in the world knew her guiltless and believed her and would not rest while breath was in him until it was set right. I could not say it aloud. I had said nothing aloud in years, but I could set it in ink and see it carried to her, and I know she kept it near to the last. Whatever else she believed at the end, she did not believe that no living soul believed her. That much I made certain of, even out of the depth of my silence. It was not enough. It was not her name nor her life, but it was not nothing. And Tamsin thought then of a small folded paper her mother had kept tucked in her prayer book through the last of the illness, and had never once explained, and had held sometimes in her thin hands without a word, her eyes far off, and she understood at last whose hand had shaped it, and she wept again. And this second weeping was not all of it grief. He asked her in the early summer in the library, at that same gray hour where the whole of it had first begun. He had cleared her name before ever he asked, and settled on her a small, quiet independence through a lawyer, out of a fund that was no fund on earth, so that she should stand free, beholden to no one, wanting nothing, able to walk out through the Kelvern gates into a world that would open to her again. He saw to all of that first. Only then did he turn to her, and he did not write it on a flyleaf, for he had done with writing where she was concerned. He said it aloud, rough still, for the voice would carry the 10 lost years in it to the end of his life, and she found she was glad of the roughness, for it was the measure of what the speaking cost him, and so of what she had come to be worth to him. There is nothing left that you need of me, he said. Your name is yours again, and your mother's with it, and your freedom above all, which I set in your hands before I let myself say one word of this, so that you could not mistake the asking for anything but what it is. You have somewhere to go now, and someone to be, and no want in the world driving you. So I can ask you clean, which the winter would never have let me do. I did not know, until you came up my cold stairs with a box under your arm, that a house could be lonely with me, the only soul in it. I know it now, because you filled the loneliness, and I will not go back to it. Do not stay as my grandmother's companion, and do not stay as a debt of mine coming due, and do not stay because you have nowhere better. Stay because you would choose it over the whole world I have just handed back to you. I have carried 10 years of unsaid things, and there is only one person alive I can bear to say them to, and I am asking her to let me spend what is left of my life in the saying. And Tamsin Larkford, who had come to that house with everything she owned in a single box and no tomorrow at all, made the one choice that was wholly and only her own, out of no fear and no need, wanting nothing she did not already hold, choosing because she chose. My mother told me once, she said, that a kindness is the single coin in the world that never loses its worth, and the world spent 2 years teaching me she was wrong, that nothing is given but a price rides behind it. And then on the coldest night of my life, a man I had never met crossed a whole cruel room to lay his own cloak over a stranger's mended shawl, and owed me nothing for the doing, and asked me for nothing after. You gave me back my mother's coin that night, before you knew my name, before it could be anything but exactly what it was. That is worth more to me than the name you cleared, though I will love you for the name too. And she reached up and laid her bare hand for the first time against the ruined side of his face, the side he had kept 10 years in the dark, and did not flinch, and felt him go still as a man who has been out in the cold so long he has half forgotten there is such a thing as warmth. Why, "Yes," she said, "I will stay, and I will marry you, and I will teach you your own voice back a word at a time. Though I warn you, I have grown fond of your quiet, and I mean to keep a good deal of it just as it is." They were married quietly at Kelvern when the summer came in, for neither loved grandeur, and the Dowager Duchess sat in the foremost pew with the air of a woman who had contrived the whole match, which she insisted to the great age she afterward reached, she very largely had. The doors that had shut upon the bride stood open now, and their owners came and were pardoned, more or less, and Tamsin cared little either way, having learned what such doors were worth. And there is a thing they kept to in the long, good years after, which no one who did not know the story could make sense of. On the wall of the Kelvern library, framed with more care than any portrait in the house, hangs to this day a worn gray shawl mended twice at the hem, and beside it an old book open to a flyleaf and one line of spare, upright writing. The small locked room off the gallery stands open now, and swept, and full of morning light, and is only a room. And every winter that came to them, on the coldest night of it, they lit every fire and every lamp in that great house on the moor until Kelvern stood ablaze from cellar to attic and threw its gold across the black moor at every window, so that any soul lost out there in the cold, on the wrong side of every door in the world, might see from far off that there was one house, at least where the warmth was not hoarded in the middle, but reached all the way to the walls, and passed them into the night, to whoever stood at the edge of things with nothing left and needed only to be seen and let in.